Hello readers, Avid Reader here, and today I thought that I would do a video that is a bit different from my usual book reviews and listicles. I'm gonna talk about here how I actually became an avid reader. So some of you may be surprised, but I was not someone who read a lot for pleasure until about 2019 or so. I did have a couple of short reading phases sometime between 2011 and 2017, I don't remember exactly when. And those phases were when I read two different series of books. So one was of course the Harry Potter books by J.K. Rowling, I read all of those. And then there was also the Cherub book series by Robert Muchamore, which I read partially in French, partially in English. That's a teenager spy series. And I liked both those book series, Harry Potter and Cherub. But apart from that, I didn't read that much for pleasure back when I lived in Belgium. I did have to read some books, of course, for school, but I did not enjoy them. But when I moved to Sweden later on, that soon changed. So I actually started reading for pleasure thanks to two YouTube videos. One of the videos was by C.G.P. Grey, which talked about how you can be a dictator, and there was also a follow-up video to that, which talked about the importance of dynasties in power. And it was a couple of videos about power politics, of how dictators and people in democracies stay in power. And these videos were based on the book called The Dictator's Handbook, and I thought that was an interesting book. I want to read that. And then there was also a series of videos by Alternate History Hub, where he covers, there were 4 of them, where he covers the timeline of the Southern Victory series by Harry Lulov, which is 11 books, which starts out with the American South winning the Civil War, and it ends in World War II. And I thought that timeline was also fascinating, of how the South would evolve differently from the North, how they would go at war with each other again in both world wars, and how different the world could have been if the South and the North had split apart. So I was at least interested to read the first book in that book series, called How Few Remain. So on my wish list for Christmas 2018, and I was 15 back then, I wished for 2 books. So I wished for Dictator's Handbook by Bruce Bueno de Mesquita and Alistair Smith, and I wished for How Few Remain by Harry Lulov. And I got those 2 books for Christmas from my parents. Plus I also got a book by F.A. Hayek called The Road to Serfdom. So I started caring about politics around the summer of 2017, and I was pretty much always somewhere on the right side of the spectrum, but it was not clear where I would be on the right side, whether I would be a conservative or libertarian or something maybe a little more sinister. But the more I read, the more I developed more clear ideas of where I was on the political spectrum, but that's later on. So the first year where I read a lot, I did read a lot in 2019, 32 books, but it was far less than the following years. So during that span of time, I read the first 8 volumes in the Southern Victory series, and I did read also Dictator's Handbook, which is my favorite nonfiction book, and I read The Road to Serfdom. And I was relatively open-minded that year, so I borrowed some books from my father, ranging across the political spectrum. So in late 2019, early 2020, I did read widely across the political spectrum. So I've read the Communist Manifesto, I've read Mein Kampf, I've read Atlas Shrugged, and I also read some philosophical books. So I did read The Prince by Machiavelli, I've read also The Art of War by Sun Tzu, and I also read a book about the history of the Magna Carta and also the Magna Carta itself. And high school helped develop which tastes I had for reading. In my first year of high school, so year 10, I really enjoyed the subject of history. So I asked my history teacher, which was a great history and global politics teacher, to recommend me some books about the 20th century, and I also wanted to learn specifically about the Spanish Civil War. So he recommended me to read in May 2020 The Origins of the Second World War by A.G.P. Taylor, The Age of Extremes by Eric Hobsbawm, which is a big history book, 600-700 pages of the short 20th century, so from 1914 to 1991, so World War I to the fall of communism. And also, I think it was The Spanish Civil War by Anthony Beevor. And The Spanish Civil War and Age of Extremes, I read both those books in Swedish, by the way. And that really developed my taste for reading history. So during the coming summer and later in 2020, I read a lot of history books. A lot of them by British historians translated into Swedish. So I've read, among other things, the long 19th century trilogy by Eric Hobsbawm. I also read some World War II books by Anthony Beevor, such as the one on the Second World War itself, one on Berlin, one on Stalingrad. All of these I read in Swedish, by the way. And I read a bunch of different history books, a mix of in Swedish and English. My next year of high school, so year 11 or year 2 of high school, I was going to take a course called Global Politics. And it sounded like an interesting course. So I asked my history/global politics teacher to recommend me some global politics books. And he did. First of all, I read the whole textbook of global politics we had next year. And it's a big textbook, but I read that all in early 2020. Yeah. But he also lent me 6 books from the library. So I did utilize my high school library quite a bit, and the libraries close by that I had access to while I lived in Sweden. So before I borrowed those books, first of all I read a book called Prisoners of Geography by Tim Marshall, but I read it in Swedish. But after I read that book, he borrowed me these 6 books, and those were Who's Ruling the World by Noam Chomsky, The Road to Unfreedom by Timothy Schneider, The New Silk Roads by Peter Frankopan, The Almighty Dollar by Darshini David, Worth Dying For by Tim Marshall, and Theories of International Politics and Zombies by, I think he's called Daniel W. Dresner or something like that. And I read these books between June and August 2020. And keep in mind, 2020, that's when COVID started. So of course, living in Sweden, we had a lot less restrictions than in the rest of the world. So we didn't have restrictions on our movement really. They did limit some events, but they didn't really restrict what we could do. So young people were still going and doing different stuff, and you usually didn't have to wear masks anywhere except maybe at the hospital. However, they did close the schools for basically the second half of my first year of high school. Then I was a lot at home, which gave me a lot more time to read. So I did read a lot that year. So unlike 2019, where I read 32 books, in 2020 I read 87 books. And I read quite widely, a bunch of different genres. So I read Stephen King's horror, I read some fantasy by Stephen King, I read some sci-fi by Michael Crichton, but I also read a lot of history and global politics. And I also read some more alternate history, mainly by Harry Turtledoff. I would say probably the time where I was most content in my life was those months where I read. So from when the school closed in early 2020 throughout the summer of 2020. So that was a very nice period of my life, where I got a lot of pleasure for reading. Some days I read 5 hours, and during the summer of 2020, that was the average time I spent reading. About 5 hours, I think. Maybe a little less. Then I came back to high school, and I took an economics course, and I decided, okay, I'm also gonna read some more economics books to understand politics better. So I read Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell, and I also read Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman. And those books, I would say, pretty much firmly made me into a free trader libertarian. But of course, taking the global politics course in high school and reading global politics books made that, unlike most libertarians, I'm not an isolationist, so I'm someone that very much likes international institutions and things like collective defense, such as the UN or NATO or the European Union, because the mainstream theory in global politics is liberalism, which strongly believes in collaboration between states. But 2020 was the peak of when I read most books, at 87. Afterwards, high school became a little harder, so I have less energy to read. So we move on to 2021. That year I read 68 books. By the way, in 2020 I finished reading all Orwell books, which I started reading in 2019, as 1984 is one of my favorite books, and some people maybe not realize this, but George Orwell has written a lot of good books. that are fiction. I was reading all of these books, and I thought it a shame that I couldn't discuss my thoughts that much with anyone, so I could talk about it with my family a bit, sure, but not enough to satisfy me. So I started this YouTube channel in May of 2020, and among the first books I reviewed were global politics books, which were my successful book reviews usually, but I reviewed a bunch of other stuff. I also made this YouTube channel, by the way, into a CAS project for high school, for the International Baccalaureate. So this YouTube channel was encouraged by both my global politics teacher, my economics teacher, my teachers in general. They approved of it in high school. And I did pass CAS mostly with this YouTube channel, which was nice. It's weird to say, but it was basically a few teachers in my high school, along with some YouTube videos I saw in middle school, which turned me into an avid reader. But of course, as you get older, you may remain an avid reader, but you're one with a bit less energy as you have to do other stuff. You have chores, you have school, you have universities, so you read less and less books. So my peak, as I said, was 87 books in 2020. Then in 2021, we come down to 68 books. In the start of 2021, I had to prepare for my high school exams. So that year I read 60 books. And of course, I finished high school in the summer of 2022. And I decided that even though this channel was no longer required for CAS, I mean, I started this channel before CAS, but for a large percentage of this channel's existence, it's been a CAS project specifically. But I decided to keep this channel going, but I started changing up the content I did a bit more. So, for example, I used to do book reviews in Swedish, but I stopped doing that. I also, over time, stopped doing different type of reviews. So I started to specialize specifically into books that are global politics, Thomas Sowell, historical fiction, and alternate history mainly, and also some listicles. So that was what I did with this channel from late 2022 to mid 2023, the year we're in now. I started university, by the way, in 2022, and since then the amount of books has decreased a bit that I read, but it's been declining quickly since I came back here to university in year 2. This brings us to today. So nowadays I live alone in the Netherlands as a university student, and I still love reading a lot. But when you're at university and you're a history student, you have a lot of reading homework, and especially this block I had a lot of it. So some days I had to spend 5 hours doing reading homework, and when you read for 5 hours, your eyes become tired, so you have less energy to read, even if it's reading for pleasure. So at the time of this recording of this video, I've read 48 books, which is pretty good, but it's far less than the amount of books that I read previously in years, such as 60 or 68 or 87 books. And I expect that next year I will read even less books. So I don't think I'll hit the 50 books mark in 2024. I guess I'm gonna read about 40 books next year, which is alright, because being a bookworm does not mean that you have to read 100 books a year. I did try to do that in 2020, but I didn't succeed. I came up to 87, not 100. Because to read 100 books, either you choose to read a bunch of shorter books. So if all the books you read were 200, 300 pages, maybe you could read 100 books, but even that's hard. But I like reading longer books sometimes. Like the books by Harry Turtledove, they're 500, 600 pages. So of course, when you read bigger books, or when you read something like The Stand or Atlas Shrugged, or big history books that are sometimes 400, 500, 600, 700, 800 pages, then you're gonna read less books in a year, which is fine. And I say that if you read about a book a month for pleasure or so, then you can call yourself a bookworm or an avid reader. And one reason why I'm reducing my YouTube uploading schedule from one video every week to one video every second week is that I have other things to do than read books, so I'm reading less books, which means I have less books to review. So the staple booktube video is a book review. But if you're reading less books and you're reading books that you don't necessarily want to review for your channel, then there's less content to make. So yeah, that's where we are with me as an avid reader and as a YouTuber or booktuber. A couple of years ago, I used to read about a couple of hours a day on average, even though I had high school. Nowadays, on university days, I read on average about 30 minutes, an hour a day, so a lot less. When you have less energy, you do, of course, other stuff than reading, things that are less mind intensive. For example, if you can see this poster back here, you can tell that I'm a big K-pop fan. And I also enjoy watching a lot of East Asian movies and TV shows, especially K-dramas. It's fine to not just have reading as your one hobby. You can do other stuff, and as long as you read about 12 books a year or so, I would say you still qualify as a bookworm. So that was my rambling of how I became an avid reader, but one who is reading a bit less books than I used to do. I hope you readers enjoyed this slightly different book-related video, and I will see you readers next time.